Now for the main event. For many of us, David needs no introduction. He has served as editor of our journal since 2017. Under his leadership, he's raised the bar in terms of content and production and established our journal as an outstanding publication showcasing books, collectors, and scholarship. David is a graduate of Haverford College, Yale University Divinity School, and the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. He's had a long and illustrious career. A common thread in David's work and personal life has been engaging with community concerns and service. The community of the book is only one of many to have benefited from David's contributions. He's worked in a variety of capacities in the nonprofit, government, educational, and philanthropic sectors for more than 4 decades. Most recently, he worked for 13 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, serving for several years before his retirement as the foundation's Director of Community and Civic Engagement. He previously served as Deputy Director for the Pacific Northwest Initiative, which oversees the foundation's work to end family homelessness. He now describes himself as an activist retiree. He currently serves on the Board of Managers of Haverford College, as Vice Chair of Building Changes, which is a nonprofit working to end homelessness in Washington State, as Board Secretary for All Rise, which oversees training and certification for alternative sentencing treatment courts across the United States, as Commissioner of and Chair of the Skagit County Fire District number 7 for Guaymas Island, and of course, an active member of the board of the Book Club of Washington and our journal editor. A little more background. David's interest in book collecting began at an early age. When he turned 12, his mother gave him a handful of New York City subway tokens, 20 cents each back then, and said to him, "This is a fascinating city. Go explore it." While most of his friends were going to see the Yankees, he discovered the Pierpont Morgan Library, which he visited every 2 weeks. One of the librarians there noticed this strange boy who was a regular visitor and eventually approached him and offered to give him a tour of areas not accessible to visitors. It was there that he developed his fascination for 15th century printed books from the first 25 years of printing in Europe, known as incunabula, that is, from the cradle in Latin. As son of labor organizers, David's early book collecting activities were limited to cheap volumes he could find in the used bookstores he frequented on 4th Avenue in New York City. Years later, when he left his job at King County and became a private consultant, he decided that he could buy just one example of an incunabulum to satisfy his childhood dreams. That began a slippery slope. Yeah, that we can all kind of relate to. He ended up collecting 55 examples of incunabula. Recently, he donated this collection and other printed books from the next century to his alma mater, Haverford College, where they were featured in the first exhibit of the newly renovated Ludwig Library and are now part of the school's curriculum, providing hands-on learning opportunities for students. David now lives on Guaymas Island in northern Puget Sound with his husband, Birch. His collecting activities are now focused on items relating to the history of Guaymas Island. We are delighted that David will now share his insights and examples from his collection regarding the history of this unique and special place. Please join me in welcoming David as the 2023 recipient of the Emory Award. I have
Good afternoon.
just a second. The part of the presentation. Sorry. So I just want to show for the record, this is the certificate, and it was printed by Bonnie Thompson Norman, who is here today, with calligraphy by Jim Jones. Jim is also a prior editor of our journal and is a wonderful calligrapher. So
Thank you.
there you go.
Beautiful.
Okay, somebody take a picture. Well, we'll get a picture later. We'll get one of those. Okay, where does it need to be?
Not in front of me.
Oh yeah, right. Oh, right here. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. And first, I'd like to thank the Book Club of Washington for naming me as this year's Emory Award winner. I'm honored to be joining my predecessors as a recipient of this award. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank individuals and institutions that have been essential in forming and supporting my interest in rare books and collections. That list starts with my husband, Birch, who is here with me today. He's tolerated my collecting passions and eccentricities since we first met more than 32 years ago. And it seems that in most successful relationships, there's a keeper and there's a tosser. And you can guess which one I am and which one Birch is. And going back even further, as Gary indicated, I need to thank my parents who put those subway tokens in my hand when I was 12 years old and said to me, "This is a fascinating city, go explore it." I think if parents were to do that today in New York, they might be reporting for child neglect, but in the 1960s, things were a little different. And as Gary indicated, although most of my friends went to baseball games on Coney Island, I gravitated to places where little boy visitors were infrequently found. And Pierpont Morgan on Library was one of those on 36th Street. And impressive. Yeah.
We're not sharing the thing.
Oh, what do we need to do? Okay, what do we need to do here?
I knew I would forget something.
Perfect. Oh, and by the way, I'll just go back to this one. This is a 15th century woodcut of it's entitled "The Book Fool," which I think describes me pretty well. Anyway, so Pierpont Morgan Library, where I went every 2 weeks, and as Gary said, and I also would commend the personal librarian to you by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray. Using well-documented material. This is a work of historical fiction that tells the remarkable story of Belle Acosta Green, who Morgan hired to build and manage his collection, even as she hid her identity as a person of color in the high society of early 20th century New York. It's a very amazing story and a wonderfully written book. I will not repeat all this stuff about the Morgan Library, where I spent a lot of time. But more within my means as a little kid was the secondhand bookstores of 4th Avenue, known as Book Row when I was a kid, between Astor Place and 14th Street, which was quite close to where I went to junior high school. And one of my school chums, Webb Keene, who's now a noted anthropologist, and I would wander these stores after school and look for treasures we could actually afford. One of those shops was Schulte's Books, and it had shelves and shelves on 2 different levels of books that Webb and I would peruse regularly. And during one visit, a book that caught my attention was a 1723 edition of The Lord's Supper by Matthew Henry, printed in Boston by Samuel Meland. It was in its original leather binding. It was priced at $8, which was well beyond my little boy budget at the time. And the owner of the bookstore saw me handling the book and saw my interest in it, and he approached me and he said, "Young man," he said, "would you like that book?" And I said, I was fascinated by the book, but it's out of my price range. He said, "Well, why don't you take it as a gift from me," he said, "and use it to start your collection." And with that, my collecting passions began. Throughout junior and senior high school, I started collecting 18th and 19th century books that caught my interest and were within my budget. As I was contemplating what college to attend, several things attracted me to Haverford College in Pennsylvania. Both its Quaker tradition. I had attended a Quaker high school in New York City, and became interested in Quakerism because of pacifism and anti-war activities during the Vietnam War, and there I am in 10th grade with my little sign I made about stopping the war in Vietnam. And as well, what's that?
Good typeface.
Yeah, no, I don't. I use
Very easy to read.
stencils. I use stencils. Right. Better than those two.
Yeah, really.
So I was attracted to Haverford both because of its Quaker history and as well as their remarkable collection of books, rare books for a small college, and the access to these books that was provided to any student who wanted to see them. Just try that at the Biontech Library at Yale. And when I was a sophomore in Haverford, I took an introduction to astronomy class, and our professor, Bruce Partridge, referenced a 1543 edition of De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestum, which is by Nicholas Copernicus, which contains the first printed depiction of the heliocentric solar system. It also, and he also in class mentioned that the college library actually had a copy of this book in its special collections, first edition. The next day, I went to the library and I asked if I could see the book. Absolutely, said the rare book librarian. I will go down to the vault and bring it up for you. I sat there in the special collections room and was able to leaf through the pages of one of the most significant scientific treatises of the 16th century. As a footnote, a copy of this book recently sold at auction in 2008 for $2.2 million. And another copy is currently for sale for $2.5 million. And on one of my regular visits to Haverford as a board member, I went to see the librarian, Terry Snyder. And I mentioned that another copy of the Copernicus in the library vault was currently for sale for $2.5 million. Her gasp was audible. And I love that my alma mater still will allow a student to sit in the library and handle a book of that rarity and value. So after I graduated from Haverford, I spent 3 years as a high school teacher before deciding teaching high school was much too challenging for me to pursue as a career. I decided to go to graduate school, as Gary indicated, and ended up with a Master in Divinity from Yale and a Master of Social Work from the University of Connecticut. I added the social work degree when I realized that a Quaker with a divinity degree is kind of like a moose with a hat rack. So because I wasn't going to get a job. And while at Yale, I continued my activism and was one of 11 students arrested while protesting the christening of the nuclear submarine Corpus Christi, which was manufactured just up the coast from New Haven in Groton, Connecticut, where the Electric Boat Company is located. And, you know, the Navy names its submarines after different cities in the United States. And how could a group of divinity students resist this opportunity? That you're naming a machine capable of massive levels of death and destruction as the body of Christ. No way, we said to each other. So we baked submarine-shaped communion wafers. We chained ourselves together in front of the entrance to the festivities, and we christened each other the body of Christ. And we, of course, were arrested. That's me being dragged away. And we all had different signs, and this one is Martin Luther King Jr. saying, "We are the body of Christ." We had all these different figures that we. So there I was dragged away because we went limp, and they had to take us away to jail. My mother was so terrified when our court date came up. She actually came all the way from New York to New London to be in court several weeks later when we stood in front of the judge, and he asked the prosecutor, Harold Dean, who we were and why we were in court. The prosecutor told the judge that we were protesters who had been arrested for blocking access to the launch of the submarine Corpus Christi. The judge looked at us and asked which of us was our attorney. "We don't have an attorney, Your Honor," we said. "We're pro se." "Well," the judge asked, "who are you?" We said, "Well, we're divinity students from Yale, Your Honor." "And what were you doing at the launch of the Corpus Christi?" he asked. "Well, we were praying, Your Honor." The judge looked at the prosecutor and said, "Harold," he said, "you arrested these kids for praying?" After a pause, he said, "Case dismissed. Get out of my courtroom." So, after graduate school, I moved back to my hometown of New York City and became the executive director of the Anti-Violence Project, a gay and lesbian anti-violence project there. I did that for more than 4 years, and David Hansel, who's here today, was my board chair. And I'm also honored that Norrin, my wonderful friend from Yale, is here as well. He's from Yale Law School, along with David. They both went to Yale Law School. And in the summer of 1989, I came to Seattle for vacation. And I was pretty burned out in New York. I'd lost 75% of my male friends to the AIDS crisis. And while I was here on vacation, bought a house and decided to move here. Now, I wasn't able to find a job right away, so I spent my first 7 months here as a Kelly girl, an office temp. I typed quite rapidly, typing insurance policies for a company, Calhoun & Black, on the 43rd floor of the Columbia Tower. In 1990, I was hired by the King County Department of Community and Human Services and spent the next 9 years and 11 months working on issues related to the intersections of mental health, substance abuse, homelessness in King County. And it was in 1991 that I met Birch at a political campaign event, and for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into here, we didn't have our first date until about a year later, but we're still together. Now, when I took my job at King County, I promised myself I wouldn't stay in local government more than 10 years. So 1 month shy of that date, I resigned from my position and started my own consulting firm, working mostly with states and counties and cities on issues similar to the work I've been doing in King County. And the business turned out to be surprisingly successful. And as Gary indicated, I was able, for the first time in my life, to maybe buy one of these books. And so I bought myself a first edition of the Regula Pastoralis by Gregory the Great. It's a guide for priests on counseling parishioners. And I thought it was both relevant to my professional training and the part-time work as a psychotherapist that I had started while working at King County. And that was the slippery slope, as Gary suggested. My collection began to grow. 15th century books, fascinating. Well, here, so my collection began to grow. So here's the slippery slope. Livy's History of Rome, beautiful chain binding. Sopra la Vita de Job, Morality in Job, with a beautiful gilt binding with, unfortunately, not real gems, fake gems in the binding. And I would say that my collection began to grow. 15th century illustrated books particularly fascinated me, including, for example, the Liber Chronicarum, which you see here, first published in 1493 by Hartmann Schedel in Nuremberg. And then a pirated edition was published 4 years later in Augsburg by Johann Schonsberger. And the first printer was furious about this, but there were no copyright laws in place. This printing was so new. So there was nothing Schedel could do about it. And although the second edition, which I used to own, is rarer than the first edition, the first edition, it doesn't hold up to the first edition quality because many of the illustrations in the 1493 edition were done by a relatively young, unknown artist apprentice working for Hartmann Schedel named Albrecht Dürer. I'm still curious. I mean, it's really interesting how they were able to create images of cities. You see Istanbul and Florence there, that were kind of aerial images that are still recognizable today. Whether they had aliens and spaceships that took them up so they could do this, I don't know. But and Livy's History of Rome has more than 400 woodcut illustrations, and several of them are shown here. One of the first images is Romulus and Remus here being suckled by wolves, and then being kidnapped or adopted by the shepherd Faustulus, taken away by a shepherd. One of my favorite illustrations here in this book shows Hannibal crossing the Alps with an elephant, believe it or not. And I just have to imagine that neither the woodcut artist or the printer had ever seen an elephant or knew what it looked like. And I just imagine kind of the woodcut carver saying to the printer, "What does an elephant look like?" And the printer said, "Oh, just make it look like a pig with long ears, tusks, and a long nose." It's like, yeah, that's it. And then there are also some pretty gruesome images, like this one of the executions that were done in ancient Rome by attaching people to 2 horses in chariots and then pulling them apart. The evolution of fonts is also an interesting part of the history of printed books. And initially, printers sought to make their fonts look like those used by scribes who copied manuscripts in order to promote the sales of books as something familiar. But that's pretty hard to read. And so over time, fonts began to be made it more readable, as you see here, the latter part of the 15th century. And some of these versions, some of the fonts we use today are actually evolved from these late 15th century fonts. And as Gary indicated before I was done, I amassed 55 of these books. And then I retired in 2019, and we gave up our Capitol Hill condo. I realized I no longer had a safe place to keep them, and I'd always intended them to go to Haverford, so I donated them to the college. And they welcomed them. Here I am at the opening exhibition, looking ridiculous. And then there was a wonderful pamphlet created, or guide to the exhibit, with an article by a long article by a woman who was a current student, Alexandra Stern, called "Who Created the New and Copied the Old Printed Books of the 15th Century." And so, what next for the keeper half of our keeper and tosser household? Well, we moved to Guimas Island, right there on the corner, and I began to evolve my collecting interests to Guimas in the northern reaches of the Salish Sea, where Birch and I bought a home in '98. And it is a fascinating place with a long and interesting history. It was home, for example, to Lawrence Kelly, a smuggler whose cargoes included both opium and Chinese laborers. And it's rumored that when he was being approached by the customs boat, whatever his cargo was went overboard, living, human, or otherwise. And it's also said that his wife would light bonfires on the bluff to warn her husband if the customs boat was patrolling near his sloop. Now, electricity came to Guimas on May 28, 1949, with considerable fanfare, as can be seen in this press photo I found on eBay, showing 3 island residents starting their oil lamps in exchange for electric lights. And one of the women in the photo here is Bubble, who was an island character, who, among other notable accomplishments, paddled her canoe together with her dog Peter through the entire inland passage, all by herself. Oh, wow. Guimas got its first post office in 1959, as now seen in this first day cover. That facility is long gone, and it remains as one of the most dilapidated buildings on the island, which is constantly at risk of collapse. In 1966 and 1967, Guimas Island almost became the site of a large aluminum processing plant. The island was rescued from this fate by a young attorney in Seattle named John Ehrlichman, who was widely admired for his expertise on urban land use and zoning. He was active in the Municipal League, supporting efforts to clean up Lake Washington, improve the civic infrastructure of Seattle and King County, and yes, it's the same John Ehrlichman who became embroiled in the Watergate scandal of the Nixon White House years later in the early 1970s. But what about the centuries before white settlers came to the Northwest and dispossessed the native residents who've been here since time immemorial? Guimas has its own unique history in this regard, as one of the homes of the Samish Nation, along with a number of other Coast Salish communities. Guimas Island was the location of the largest native longhouse in the region, and when the Samish community was evicted from their homes on the island, much of that lumber in these dwellings was stolen by white settlers to build their homes. One of the items I found on eBay, I'm an avid eBayer, I search Guimas Island regularly, is an amazing image taken in 1889 by J.O. Bowen, a noted frontier photographer. The image is of John L. Matthews, a Samish native, who inscribed on the back of the card, "To Mrs. Harriet Wooten," with the words, "Guimas, Skagit County, Washington, taken October 26, 1889. It's interesting to note that Thomas Wooten, a direct descendant from Harriet Wooten, is the current tribal chair, and Dana Matthews, a direct descendant of John L. Matthews, is the current tribal secretary. And this image will find its permanent home with the Samish Nation archives at some point in the future. Now, Guimas Island was known among the Coast Salish communities, and I will butcher this pronunciation because I can't do the glottal stops correctly, as incunabula, or translates into English as lots of dogs island. And the reason for this is that it was an island on which they raised their Salish woolly dogs, whose hair was used to weave blankets. Very few of these blankets remain, although there are images of Coast Salish communities with these small Spitz-like dogs. There's one of them. And one of these blankets is currently housed in the Burke Museum in Seattle. So there's another picture of one of these dogs. Here is an early photograph of a woolly dog with two Coast Salish women. And recently we were fortunate to, Birch and I were able to visit the Burke and actually see the blanket while we were taken on a tour by the new director of the Burke, Dr. Gabriela Chavaria. These blankets are very rare today, even rarer than 15th century printed books. Less than 50 are known to still exist. So living on Guimas Island, Birch and I have recently become what we call the stewards of a 120-acre parcel of forest land that we have named Dog Woods in honor of the history of the island. Birch has cataloged more than 90 native plants and trees that inhabit Dog Woods. And here's an image of Birch, fittingly, hugging a birch in Dog Woods. We've welcomed the public to visit Dog Woods and the 2.5 miles of trails that have been built by our neighbors and professional trail builders, Jimmy and Lou Lemieux, right here, with their cool dog Cooper. And perhaps most significantly, we have welcomed our Coast Salish neighbors into the woods to harvest various plants and materials that they use for cultural activities and purposes. Here's an image of 4 members of the Samish Culture Committee visiting Dog Woods and holding a segment of birch that they removed from a downed tree. And it seems fitting that Birch and I are now focused on a collection of living things that will, in time, we believe jointly to the Skagit Land Trust and the Samish Nation, to be preserved as a permanent nature trust to be enjoyed by future generations. And again, I'll wrap it up here. It's an honor to receive this award, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my remarks with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Oh, any questions?
Any questions?
David?
Yes.
Are there dogwoods in dogwoods?
Yes, there are. Yes. You answer, Bert. You're the plant guy.
There are these small ground cover dogwoods. There's red-twig dogwood, and we are slowly breaking into the native city dogwood.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there are lots of dogs that love running in dogwoods. Although we've been careful this spring, that we have some coyotes in dogwoods, and some of the coyotes were chasing some of the dogs, but none of the dogs got killed. Few injuries, but nothing serious. Yes.
How far is it from?
It's about an hour and 15 minutes by car. You drive to Anacortes, and then in Anacortes, you take a little ferry that takes about 8 minutes to cross the channel, holds 24 cars, and then you're on Guimas Island. It's a fun place to visit. It really is. Pretty magical. What's that? Guimas Island, just north of Anacortes. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Well, so how often is the ferry?
Oh, it runs every hour, and then during peak times every half hour.
But does it still quit running at 5 in the afternoon?
Stops at 8 o'clock on weeknights and 10 o'clock on weekends. Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions.
Oh,
here.
sure.
So first of all, you miss collecting. Can't pronounce it.
Incunabula.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, I mean, I loved it while I was doing it, and I don't miss it because my life is so full. Yeah.
So you never attempted to grab another one?
No. Virtually, that's something to say about that too. Yeah. Yeah.
What attracted you to social?
That's a great question. So I'm the son, as I mentioned, of 2 labor organizers, and from an early age, I would go with my father to walk picket lines with him when workers were striking. My mother wrote the first history of working women in America called "We Were There," the story of working women in America, and they taught me that the best thing you can do with your life is to do good things for other people. So I owe my parents that. And I think that's one of the reasons that, and I also did the social work degree so I could get a job after divinity school, because as a Quaker, that was not a very useful degree. I had amazing advisors in divinity school. And I actually taught there for 2 years after I graduated. even though the dean hated my guts because I was a queer activist while I was at Yale. And I did my thesis, my final thesis. The title of it was The Homosexuality of Christ. And I wrote that because I had read, James Cone, and that Jesus was black, and my advisor, Letty Russell, who was a major feminist theologian, a Methodist minister and feminist theologian, encouraged me to take that liberation theology into the queer arena. And funny story, I ended up graduating first in the class, which in divinity school is not that hard. And the dean, who didn't like me very much, had to announce my thesis topic at graduation to everybody at class. And as I'm waiting there, I could see he hadn't read his notes, and he was looking down his notes, and I could see him go like this. And I thought, what is he going to say? And so he said, And now graduating first in the class, is David Wertheimer, whose thesis topic was the love of Christ. And a lot of people were like, oh, he wrote about Christ. That's really good. And as I walked across the stage, he answers a plum with your left hand. He pulled me in with his right hand, and he said, now get off my campus. Now, Letty Russell, who was my advisor, I had designed a class called Ministry for Social Change that combined social work and theology. And Letty, who had one glass eye because she had eye cancer, she looked at you always very strangely. You can never tell which eye was the right eye. She said, well, now that you've designed this class, you have to come here and teach it. And I said, that's not going to happen. The dean hates my guts. And she leaned in and looked and she said, watch and learn. And for 2 years, I taught that class at Yale.